Okay. As I told you, I'm a one-man studio, so sometimes the lighting and presentation or, or even just subtle sort of how well I've combed my hair or something. This isn't really about what I look like. What is important is that you focus on the main points that I put on the board. Everything that I put on the board in part one and part two are just kind of illustrations of what you read in the book, just to simplify things somewhat. And I know there's a little bit of there's some arrows and things around, but this is sort of a progression. This is the past, and this is the past, and this is the ancient past. So we can't talk about we don't have time to talk about Romans anymore. But King Arthur, I do want to talk about first, because we have no evidence of him actually being a person. He's a mythological person. Was there some kind of warlord who worked, tried to prevent the Anglo-Saxons, who would later become the English, from invading and taking over and dominating what had been 300 years of Romano-Briton culture? So the story is that there were several warlords that fought against, the invasions of the Saxons. These are Germanic tribes. There's a third. I don't really talk about Kent, but there is 7 kingdoms, and Kent is very special because it's right in the corner of England, and it's the part of England that's closest to France. It's right against the English Channel. So Kent supposedly was founded by the Jutes. So you've got 3 Anglo-Saxon, Anglian kingdoms, and you have 3 Saxon kingdoms and 1 Jute kingdom. But the Jutes usually don't get a lot of attention because they were a non-factor. However, later on in the course, they will become very important, because what happens is anybody who attacks southern England attacks Kent first. And whenever there's unrest or disappointment or anger against the king or the government, it generally, the protests come from Kent. I'll demonstrate to you some of the greatest, almost revolutions, where the peasants revolts that started in Kent, but there were multiple. It's partly because if somebody attacks from Europe, Kent is the first people to be attacked. So that kingdom never developed and never became important. So first of all, let's just recap. Originally, there were Celtic tribes called the Britons. The Romans moved in, and they became the dominant culture for hundreds of years, left a very strong impression on the British native people and Romanized them. But as soon as, the Romans withdrew and the military and the expertise and the resources were gone, Londinium fell into sort of disrepair. It was a sort of imitation of Rome at its height, and people forgot how to, make running toilets and build colosseums, and trade networks disintegrated, and basically the Romans had their hands full with the Germanic people, who were starting to invade the empire for various reasons. That's a long story. We can't go into that too much. But the Roman Empire starts to collapse, and Britannia is pretty much the least important, farthest away in the corner, sort of, Roman province. So one of the first things that happens is they need more soldiers, so they just remove all the legions, right? So you remember when Boudica attacked, what happened was the legions got together and then they massacred. Boudica was destroying all the Roman settlements and killing Romans, but once the Roman legions got organized, they really cut the Britons to pieces, and that was the last real serious rebellion. But as I told you, the Romans realized that approach, that brutal, aggressive, dominant approach that the governor was using, was causing more problems than it was worth. So they replaced the governor, and Agrippa, a famous politician and military guy, he went up there, and he just encouraged the spread of Roman culture, and rather than taking over all the territory and raping all their women and destroying their kingdoms and taking possession of them, they started to try and integrate the Britons into Roman culture. So that's what happened. The Romano-Britons were kind of a subculture, not a counterculture. So they started dressing like Romans and everything. But for the most part, they weren't part of the military. So when the military left, there wasn't much there to defend them. So that's the whole myth about King Arthur, is that he tried, throughout his life with his magical sword and his paladins and his knights and stuff. None of it really makes sense. I will show you a picture on Friday of, a painting of him, and he really looks like a French king from about 800 years ago. What he actually looked like was definitely not a medieval French king. Probably had a beard. Well, we've talked about beards a little bit. All these people here, after the Romans, they, the whole Europe kind of collapses. Unlike China, for example, where I was just reading about China and why is China such a big country and Europe is just a bunch of 50 different countries that are always fighting each other. That's a good question. It's very, very, there's a lot of reasons for that, but China is now bigger than it ever was. The Chinese Empire was never as big as it is now. And in contrast, the British Empire is gone, and the United Kingdom is as small as it's ever been. And China and America are the great, and Russia, they have huge amounts of territory and resources, and they are essentially, dominant global powers. But we got to focus on just how British culture sort of develops. You can see, like I said, geography is destiny. So once the Romans leave, and there's not really, they don't have their own military at this point. They're sort of Roman citizens, or in some cases slaves or servants or whatever, or farmers and everything. The people who protect England are the Romans, and then they leave. And so there's waves of barbarians that attack. The most prominent group are the Angles and the Saxons. And like I said, at some point there was 7 kingdoms there, and gradually though the Vikings started invading around 700 AD. After these 7 kingdoms in England were established, some of this stuff, almost all of this stuff, is in the book in more detail. So I'm just going over this for you so that you can hear it simply, and you can check it, when you make notes in lecture and I talk, then it's gone. But you can watch this recording again and again if you want. So what happens is the great age of Vikings begins, where for whatever reason, maybe because of overpopulation, maybe because there's different groups of Vikings fighting each other, so they go, sometimes they go as individuals, sometimes they go as groups, but the Vikings were excellent seafarers. They could, even though it was super dangerous to go out in the ocean, they had very long, flexible boats called longboats, and those boats could cross, stormy, windy, cold, North Atlantic water. And they went to Ireland, they went to England, they went to Scotland, they went all the way around down to Italy. There's hundreds of years of just Vikings harassing everyone, but England is the closest target. The easiest thing is to go right across from Denmark, and England is a relatively wealthy, though it's small, relatively wealthy, stable kingdom, but divided into 7 different kingdoms. Some of them are stronger than others. So the Vikings come in and they start smashing the kingdoms one by one, until the northern, almost all of England is dominated by the Vikings, right? And there's this one guy left, pretty much. He's right here, Alfred the Great. And you can look in your textbook and you can find, there's some interesting little anecdotes about his behavior. He's one of those guys, he wasn't physically healthy per se. He had a lot of stomach trouble. I guess he had sort of chronic stomach disease. He had 2 or 3 older brothers, so he wasn't supposed to be the king. But his older brothers died early, and his older brothers' children couldn't fight Vikings. So it turned to Alfred, who was, I think, the 3rd son or the 4th son. And usually the 3rd or 4th son, they usually become a monk or, go to church and become a priest or something like that. They don't really have a role as a leader or a king in a kingdom. So Alfred is quite religious. He goes on a pilgrimage to Rome, which when he's young, that at the time, you can imagine how slow that would be, taking ships and walking all the way to Rome. That round trip is probably going to take you 3 or 4 months, right? But he did this when he was a kid, and when he met the Pope, and the Pope gave him his blessing, and for some reason, the rumor is that he said he would become a great leader. And as he grew up, his older brothers were both king, but then, they died from various causes. Anything can kill you at this time. Remember, there's no doctors or anything, so you get cut in a battle and it gets infected and you die, or you get a disease, even diarrhea, which, it doesn't, that's annoying, but it's not gonna end up killing you. But in the medieval times, that's something that could literally, especially if you were dirty and fighting and you had a stomach problem and, there's no clean toilets anywhere, you can just imagine how easy it was to to die. Sometimes when, these battles happen between different, tribes and the English and the Vikings and so on, sometimes, disease killed more people than actual, weapons. That's right up until now. It still sometimes happens. 100 years ago, when people were fighting, in Africa and in the jungle, the Spanish fighting in South America and in Mexico, trying to prevent the Mexican Revolution. That climate is deadly, and if you're not used to it, it can easily kill you. So same thing with what the country we know now is Haiti, which is, again, now it's an independent country, but it was called Saint-Domingue, and it was part of the French Empire. We'll have to talk about Napoleon briefly because he's so influential on the development of British culture too. But Napoleon sent a huge army over to, stabilize, because they were growing sugar there, which was a huge money-making business. Slaves were growing sugar in the fields, and he sent home, thousands of soldiers there, and half of them died from disease. So the Haitians didn't really have to do a lot in order to keep them. They just had to let General Jungle do his business. So there's a few key things I want you to remember here. The order is important. First Britons, then Romans, then Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, and there were 7, right? And then the Vikings come along and they cause havoc to the point where Alfred the Great, which one of the reasons he's a Sejong type character is because he's an administrator, he's a good commander, he's fair, right? He's religious. Sejong, I don't think necessarily was religious in the sense that, like, he wasn't religious like a Christian or something, but certainly Sejong was reasonable, and he did things like developed Hangul, but he also, fought pirates, and he prevented, he stabilized the country. Goryeo started in ended. Chosun started in 1392, right? With, I guess it was Taejo, King Taejo was the first one. So several generations later, the whole, Korean culture has to sort of adapt to the new, type of culture they have. Goryeo was really close to the Mongolians, and now, Chosun is very close to the Myeong. So this is the thing is, there's dominance, there's this power relationship between these groups. So because the Vikings were there for so long, and they were not Christian, the Germans, the Romans really were not really Christian. They became Christian in Europe, in especially Italy, but the Romans who were in Britannia and the Britons really weren't interested in the doctrine of the church and joining, partly because they're crazy barbarians and they like fighting and killing, and they think that dying in battle and that's not really what Christianity is about. Christianity is, more of a pacifist sort of, Jesus teaches us to be friendly to our fellow man, and to be generous and to treat each other the way you would like to be treated, and so on. Jesus never picked up a spear or led people into battle. He was not a warrior. So there's a problem here, especially for the Vikings, because they love fighting, and they think that if you fight and you die, then you go to Viking heaven. So, like I said, to Viking was a verb. Going Viking was kind of exploring, adventure, but fighting and stealing and gaining a reputation for your fighting ability and your prestige and everything. So there's lots of theories. Some of those Vikings were probably leaving because they wanted to go and get precious things: gold, slaves, women, land, resources, weapons, and kill. And they were a violent people, so sometimes they were trading, no doubt, but often what would happen would be that the the longboats would come right up the rivers, right to where the city would be. Like I said, London is right at the point where ships kind of have to stop because it's it gets narrow. So it's the perfect spot to defend. But then generally, the Vikings were coming up all the rivers that the Anglo-Saxons, who are becoming the English, they are not natural sea. You think of the British as being a great naval power, and they rule the seas, and everybody has to respect them. But now it's not the case anymore. It's the Americans who control the ocean. But back 1,000 years ago, they weren't the dominant, naval power or anything. So Alfred the Great tried to make a navy. His navy failed. The Viking ships were much faster and they were much more experienced. But he attempted, to fight back. He was very smart, so he studied Latin. He read the Bible. He wrote some philosophical and religious almost like essays, sort of, and he commissioned the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, which is one of the primary sources for us to understand what's going on. But the Vikings are around for a long time, and the Romans are around for a long time. So you can see how everybody thinks that England is some sort of pure, and quite frankly, Korea too. But what happens, is that everybody mixed together. There's a whole bunch of different groups of people, and this created a language called Old English. So originally the Anglo-Saxons were speaking some sort of old Germanic language, but they started, the language started changing into something that wasn't really German. And once we get to the end here for today, finish chapter 1, you're going to find out that the last really big, dominant culture to come in and change the way things work in terms of language and culture and government and system are going to be the Normans. But that's in chapter 2, so you don't have to worry about that. So what happens is there's a struggle between the Germans and the Vikings for hundreds of years, and they end up sort of, Alfred has one kingdom left. It's called Wessex. When it comes to questions about Alfred, I mean, there's pretty much only positive things about him. Something you might want to consider is his physical weakness, right? He wasn't a good naval commander. He wasn't a particularly good warrior himself, because he was not healthy. So he wasn't one of those kings that was really tall and big and charged with all his soldiers and attacked with a gigantic sword. There's other kings like that. But what Alfred did was everything. He was an administrator, and he consolidated, and he designed the system to defend against these Vikings that kept raiding. They started organizing, militia and training and making forts. So whenever these Vikings came up the river, everybody would, run inside the fort. All the soldiers would get their bows and arrows, and the Vikings didn't really have a good way to get into those forts. Hundreds of years later, you're going to have Normans going down to build castles in the Middle East, but that's for another chapter. But Normans are half French and half Vikings. So the Franks, those are different people though. The Vikings are a lightning raid type of people. They show up, they steal everything, they kill a bunch of people, then they disappear, right? Anyway, they end up having control of the northern half of England, but Alfred, one of his greatest achievements is he sort of created the North Korea, South Korea split. He retook, after the Vikings took over everything, he was stuck in the corner like the Pusan pocket in the Korean War, and then he pushed the Vikings all the way up the British Isles to the north. So the city of York, which is sometimes called the northern capital of England, that's generally a Viking town. There's tons of blonde-haired Danish people there to this day. So that area was ruled by the Vikings, and they used this sort of policy called the Danelaw. So within that territory, the laws and the rules were Viking laws. And south, the better part of the country, to be honest, the bottom half where England is, which is a lot more mild and has more people and has more resources, Alfred was the king of Wessex, and then retook London, and then his son and his grandson expanded, England back into the Anglo-Saxon kingdom, back into it approximately what it was before the Vikings came. So the Vikings continued to attack, though, right into 1000 AD. And there were some bad Anglo-Saxon kings. Alfred the Great was the best. But his son was good, his grandson was good. But as the line continues, sort of the princes and kings get worse and worse. So you end up with this guy who's a Viking called Canute the Great. And the Vikings are still in the north of the British Isles. They're up there with the Scottish, and they're really controlling northern England, and they're controlling Ireland, and they're heading over to Iceland soon. They're exploring all over the place. They're going down to Spain. They're attacking people in France. The Normans that will take over England, they're in fact, from Normandy. So King William, when he takes over England, he's the King of England and he's the Duke of Normandy at the same time. that will take some explaining to do, so we'll do that after the quiz. But like I said, the quiz is going to be a paper version this time, just because I like to do it using Google Forms, and because there's lots of metrics and they tell you like the averages and which questions are harder and which questions are easier and so on. But just to avoid any problems, the last thing I want to do is have some sort of technical issue when we need to get this quiz done this Friday, okay? So, Canute the Great, what happens is basically the Anglo-Saxon line dies out, except for Edward the Confessor, but he's not really a typical king. He's not interested in being a king. He doesn't like fighting. He runs away to France, and Canute and his son, they end up ruling. England, Scotland, Ireland, Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. So there's this just a very brief period where the king of Denmark is the king of the north. Something like a Game of Thrones situation where he's the king of like 7 kingdoms. So they call it the North Sea Empire. But he was a pretty fair ruler, and he was not vicious or violent or aggressive or unfair to the English. So he gets the title Canute the Great as well. But just remember, he's not English. He's a Viking. When he dies, some of his sons are in north, in Sweden and Denmark and Norway. His son that is supposed to take over his kingdom in England dies. So he has no heir, which means that who's supposed to be the next king? The only person remaining is this kind of quiet guy who likes to go to church and isn't very interested in being king, but he's the only one that has the Anglo-Saxon blood descended from Alfred. So at the very end of the book, not at the very end of the book, but at the very end of chapter 1, you can take a look at Edward the Confessor, and he was a pretty decent king, but being decent isn't good enough really when there's Vikings all over the place and warriors trying to take over kingdoms. So what ends up happening is he becomes a great disappointment. First because he gets married and he doesn't have any children. So everybody knows when he dies who's going to become the king. That creates the friction where, is it going to be a Viking king? Is it going to be an Anglo-Saxon, person who's powerful but not, related to Alfred? Or is it going to be William the Conqueror from Normandy? And perhaps you can guess by the name William the Conqueror who wins that one. Okay, so there are these groups of people. Their influence is obviously, there's some language influences. For example, the TH that lots of people dislike. It depends on your country whether you have a TH in your country, but this sound, right? There was actually a symbol for it called thorn, because a lot of languages don't use the TH like that. We have two. It's the th and the. There's the vibrating one. And anyway, those pronouns, right? When you talk about using pronouns like them and there, well, that's not a pronoun, but possessives there, right? Many of these th words where we used to say thou instead of you, but you sounds a little bit more, smoother, more like some word from French, which I don't know, sounds more sophisticated, but there's a whole group of words, Germanic and Danish words, that had great influence on the development of Old English. And then when you get to Middle English, that's when all the French words come in. When the kings of France are fighting with the English over French territory, and William comes to England and he doesn't know how to speak English. He tries, but then people start damaging stuff and not listening to his orders. So he says, all right, that's it. I'm not going to speak English. I give up studying. Instead, I'm going to burn everybody's houses until they stop bothering me. So we'll get to that in chapter 2, but this is the progression. So the first 1,000 years of British culture is constant influx. Some of it's immigration, some of it's trade, some of it isn't aggressive or dangerous or fighting. It's not, but the Vikings do try to subdue the entire island, and Alfred the Great is the military leader who organizes the resistance and pushes them back. So despite the fact that he was personally weak, he was brave, intelligent, and pious, right? Always prayed, always went to church. He was a good man and did his duty as much as he could. Edward the Confessor also, I don't know what the issue was between him and his wife. Nobody really knows. But it's really important for a king or a queen to have a child, and they weren't interested, or I'm not sure. We can speculate, but maybe it was not his fault. Maybe it was something, a physical problem for one of them where they couldn't do it. But they didn't seem to really love each other. So that might have been a factor. So that's the end of the chapter. You got to go through, what are the influences of Vikings? What's their behavior? That's the kind of questions I'm going to ask. I'm going to ask you about evolution, revolution, or some of these social contexts and stuff. But there's a bunch of material, right? Mostly it's going to be, this is very simple. There's a lot more information in the book. So make sure you add to your knowledge. You don't have to know everything. Don't study like that. But I expect you to know what's on the board and to make your notes. Chapter 1's not very long. So I would like to, you to be prepared. So this is the second part. We'll hold off for any more cyber lectures this week until a quiz is done, and then more cyber lectures will have to be done. Now that I'm getting the hang of it, I think things will go much more smoothly. And honestly, I had the hardest time uploading. I think it's 5:30 in the morning right now. So this is, if you see me in class tomorrow and I'm almost dead, you know why. I've been trying to fix all of the issues that we've had. So hopefully things are going to go smooth. All right. So make sure the first part is already up and linked, and the second one will be, I'm going to have to take a nap. It's almost 6. I'm going to have to take a nap for a couple hours or I'm going to die. So I will see you in class, and I will be uploading before I go to bed, I'll upload the video, and the link will be available too. If you just go to my YouTube page, once you find the link, if you just go to the YouTube page, you can watch it anytime you want. Just make sure that you watch it at least once using your ID and your CNU portal access, because if you don't get credit for the attendance. So the first part is about 30 minutes long, and you have to watch for at least 25 minutes. Then you get credit for your attendance. If you don't do that, then, well, you have only yourself to blame. So make sure that you watch it at least once through the CNU portal. But if sometimes the video is up early and you want to watch it, you can watch it just on YouTube. You just have to click the subscription button or the like button, or and every time I do it, it'll pop up in your feed and you can watch it right away whenever it is. But officially, most times it'll be uploaded on Wednesday, and you do have to do it. If you watch it early, you do have to watch it through the CNU portal when the link is there too. Okay? Just a reminder. All right. So part 2 will be available tomorrow, and make sure you review in detail chapter 1 and the end of chapter of the introduction. And yeah, it's just a quiz. So see how you do. Okay? Thank you for listening to part 2. I'm going to probably collapse for a little bit, and I'll see some of you quite soon. Have a good day.